On October 29, 1975, the President of the United States told New York City to drop dead, and he meant it. The city was hours, literally hours, away from defaulting on its debt. Garbage rotted in mountains on the sidewalks. The South Bronx burned with 40 fires a night. The subway had become a rolling crime scene. By every measure, New York was dying. And yet, at the exact same moment, in that exact same city, 3 teenagers in different boroughs were inventing the future. They didn't know each other. They'd never meet. But what they created that decade, hip-hop, punk, and modern art, would define the next 50 years of global culture. How does a city that's falling apart become the coolest place on earth? The popular memory of 1970s New York is split down the middle. On one side, you've got the nightmare city. Imagine Taxi Driver, right? Steam rising from subway grates, Times Square drowning in neon sleaze. That version is real. It happened. But there's another version, where CBGB is packed with kids who just invented punk rock, where DJ Kool Herc is in the Bronx looping breakbeats on 2 turntables, where Andy Warhol and Truman Capote are at Studio 54 while confetti falls like snow, where Patti Smith and Robert Mapplethorpe are eating day-old bread in the Chelsea Hotel, making art in a freezing apartment. Both versions are completely true. And that's the thing nobody tells you about 1970s New York. The grit wasn't separate from the soul. The grit was the soul. The collapsing infrastructure, the bankruptcy, the fires, all of that created the exact conditions that let 3 global cultural movements explode at once. Between 1970 and 1980, New York lost 1 million residents. The South Bronx lost 250,000 people and 40% of its housing in fires and arsons. When President Carter visited Charlotte Street in 1977, the street itself had been removed from city maps because nothing was left to map. The city was genuinely dying. Banks refused to buy municipal bonds. Default seemed hours away until the teachers' union invested $150 million from their pension funds. Teachers gambling their retirement to save a city that had just laid off 40,000 workers. And yet, in that same decade, hip-hop was born at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue. Punk rock coalesced in a Bowery dive bar. Modern disco started in David Mancuso's apartment as a sanctuary for people who couldn't get into clubs anywhere else. Graffiti writers turned subway cars into rolling art galleries. Artists claimed factory lofts in Soho for $300 a month. So what happened? How does a bankrupt city become a cultural supernova? The answer is weirdly simple. When the city stopped functioning as a regulator, it started functioning as an incubator. When rent dropped low enough, artists could survive. When police stopped patrolling, graffiti writers could paint. The collapse created exactly what creativity needed: time, space, and desperation. We're going to talk about just how dark it got. The 1977 blackout where 1,600 stores were looted in one night, the fires that consumed entire neighborhoods, the subway where 250 felonies happened every week. We're not romanticizing danger, but we're also going to talk about what that darkness produced, about the people who refused to abandon each other, who took the ruins of the industrial age and built something entirely new, about a city that almost died, but whose people absolutely would not let it. The New York Daily News didn't mince words. On October 30th, 1975, their front page screamed, "Ford to city, drop dead." President Gerald Ford hadn't used those exact words, but that was the message. No federal bailout. New York was on its own. Inside City Hall, Mayor Abraham Beame had already prepared a statement announcing that New York City had insufficient cash on hand to meet debt obligations. In plain English, we're broke. Default was scheduled for that afternoon. But here's what stopped it. And this detail tells you everything about who actually saved New York. It wasn't the banks or the federal government. It was the teachers. The United Federation of Teachers agreed, literally hours before catastrophe, to invest $150 million from their pension funds into city securities that every bank in America had declared worthless. Teachers, people who'd just watched the city lay off thousands of their colleagues and balloon class sizes to 50 students per room, bet their retirement on a city that was falling apart. The crisis didn't appear out of nowhere. Between 1969 and 1975, about 400,000 jobs vanished. Factories that had sustained generations were moving south or closing. Meanwhile, the middle class fled to suburbs, taking their tax dollars with them. The austerity that followed was brutal. 40,000 city workers lost their jobs. More than a dozen firehouses closed, many in the South Bronx where they were needed most. Schools lost art programs, music programs, gym classes. The school day was shortened by 90 minutes. Free tuition at City University ended for the first time ever. Police distributed pamphlets at airports titled "Welcome to Fear City," a survival guide for visitors to the city of New York. The pamphlets warned tourists to stay off the streets after 6 p.m. Do not take the subway for any reason whatsoever. Stay in your hotel. But here's the strange thing. When documentary filmmakers interviewed ordinary New Yorkers about the fiscal crisis, most people showed less anxiety about the crisis itself and more excitement about being on TV. Life continued. People still went to work, still sat on their stoops, still threw block parties. The city was bankrupt on paper, but on the street level, people were adapting, surviving, finding ways forward. And in those gaps, in the spaces where the city stopped regulating, something unexpected started growing. Let's talk about what it meant to live in New York when the city was cheap. A cup of coffee at a diner cost 25 cents with unlimited refills. The subway token was 35 cents through 1972, then jumped to 50 cents. Movie tickets ran about $1.50 to $2.50. Concert tickets were roughly $10. But the real story is rent. Average rent citywide hovered around $335 per month. In Soho, artists were claiming former factory lofts for about $300 monthly. These weren't luxury spaces, no kitchens, no heating, sometimes no running water. You were basically squatting in an industrial building the owner had given up on. But $300. For a space so massive you could build walls wherever you wanted. Think about what that meant for creativity. You could work a couple shifts waiting tables, maybe 3 days a week, and cover your rent for the month. That left 4 days to paint, to write, to rehearse, to figure out this new thing with turntables. Patti Smith describes eating day-old bread and sharing a single subway fare with Robert Mapplethorpe. They were poor, genuinely poor, but they had time. They had space. At Westbeth Artists Housing, rents were $100 a month. One sculptor, now 78 and still working there, said it simply, "Westbeth was a savior. To afford a studio, I would have had to work full-time." This is the equation that no longer exists, where art and survival are compatible, where you can dedicate yourself to something that doesn't pay, because existence itself doesn't require that much money. On August 11, 1973, an 18-year-old Jamaican immigrant named Clive Campbell threw a party in the rec room at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue in the South Bronx. His sister Cindy organized it to raise money for school clothes. Admission was 25 cents for girls, 50 cents for boys. Clive, who went by DJ Kool Herc, had brought his sound system. That night, he invented something. He noticed that dancers waited for a specific part of each song, the break, that moment when the drums took over. So Herc started extending it. He had 2 copies of the same record on 2 turntables. When the break was about to end on the first turntable, he'd switch to the second and play it again. Back and forth. He called it the merry-go-round. He could turn a 6-second drum solo into a 5-minute loop of pure percussion fury. That's where hip-hop started. In a rec room in a building that's still standing, at a party that cost a quarter to get into. But hip-hop didn't grow in clubs. Clubs were expensive and often discriminatory. So it grew in parks, at block parties. DJs would tap into streetlights to steal electricity from the city, grid and set up massive speaker systems. The parties were free or cheap, open to everyone. Afrika Bambaataa converted his gang into the Zulu Nation, a non-violent cultural movement. Grandmaster Flash refined the turntable techniques. By 1976, Flash and the Furious Five were packing the Audubon Ballroom, 315 Bowery. That's where punk happened. A bar called CBGB, the owner, Hilly Crystal, opened it on December 10, 1973, with one rule: no cover bands. Bands had to play original music. On August 16, 1974, the Ramones played their first CBGB set. It lasted approximately 12 minutes, just relentless, abrasive noise played as fast as humanly possible. As Joey Ramone explained, "We don't play short songs, We play long songs really fast. The venue was a graffiti-scarred ground-floor sweatbox. The bathroom stalls had no doors, but it launched the Ramones, Blondie, Television, Talking Heads, and Patti Smith. The punk look came from necessity, not fashion. Richard Hell was the first to wear torn t-shirts held together with safety pins because his clothes were literally falling apart, and safety pins were the cheapest way to fix them. Malcolm McLaren saw Hell's look, took it back to London, and sold it to the world via the Sex Pistols. Disco happened in two places at once. The Loft, in David Mancuso's NoHo apartment starting in 1970, was where it really began. Invitation-only rent parties that were radically inclusive. Gay men, black people, Latinos, women, anyone who needed a sanctuary. Then there was Studio 54, which opened in 1977. Steve Rubel stood at the entrance every night, personally deciding who got in. He turned away 1,400 people on Saturday nights. Inside, it was a drug-fueled playground for celebrities. Bianca Jagger rode in on a white horse for her birthday. The Loft and Studio 54 represent disco's duality, one a sanctuary built by excluded people, the other a spectacle built on exclusion itself. Both were disco, both were New York. The Stoop, that's Dutch from when New York was New Amsterdam, was the social network before social networks existed. In the evenings, especially before air conditioning became common, everyone came outside. Windows stayed open. Spontaneous conversations happened constantly. One man remembered his grandfather taking a pillow to sit on the top step, smoking cigars, waiting for neighbors to stop and talk. Another recalled having to say good morning numerous times on the way to school because you passed that many neighbors who expected acknowledgement. The bodegas served as anchors, especially in Puerto Rican neighborhoods. The corner stores stocked plantains and ajacito alongside lottery tickets and beer. Men would play congas outside with beer bottles at their feet. The bodega owners often knew their customers' personal problems. I do counseling here too, one explained. Block parties flourished. DJs powered their sound systems by tapping into streetlights, and the parties would go until dawn or until police shut them down. The main purpose was to bring folks together, a celebration of life in a safe space away from violence. Kids had a freedom that seems impossible today. One person remembered, I played outside, unsupervised, until dusk. Walked to elementary school alone beginning in first grade. At 10, I had a key to my house and no one thought twice about it. Stickball used a broom handle and a rubber ball called a spalding, with manhole covers as bases. Double Dutch became competitive. And every summer, kids opened fire hydrants to cool off, water spraying across the street while adults watched from stoops. This closeness existed because necessity created it. People couldn't afford to go out much, so entertainment happened on the street. Parents couldn't afford babysitters, so the neighborhood watched the kids collectively. The community wasn't a choice, it was survival. But that doesn't make it less real. July 13th, 1977. 9:34 p.m. Lightning struck a substation on the Hudson River. By 9:37, the entire Con Edison system had collapsed. 9 million people plunged into darkness. The context matters. The city was in a brutal heat wave, mid-90s temperatures with high humidity. The Son of Sam murders remained unsolved, and people were terrified. Then the lights went out. Unlike the 1965 blackout, which people remembered for its cooperation, this one unleashed chaos. 1,616 stores were damaged, 1,037 fires were set, 4,500 looters were arrested, the largest mass arrest in city history. 550 police officers were injured. Thieves backed cars to stores, tied ropes around security gates, and used vehicles to rip them away. 50 new Pontiacs were stolen from one dealership in a single night. Bushwick was devastated. 35 blocks of Broadway destroyed, 134 stores looted, 45 set on fire. But the chaos wasn't universal. In many neighborhoods, people directed traffic, checked on elderly neighbors, organized impromptu barbecues. Italian neighborhoods organized patrols to protect local businesses. And then there's the hip-hop connection. According to Grandmaster Caz, it was pandemonium. Everybody just fanned out towards stores. DJ equipment, turntables, mixers, amplifiers, was stolen that night. Expensive equipment that aspiring Bronx DJs couldn't afford suddenly flooded the neighborhood. Did the blackout create hip-hop? No. But did it accelerate its explosion by redistributing the technology needed to practice? The timeline suggests yes. The myth that there were 1,000 new DJs the next day is probably exaggerated, but the fundamental truth seems solid. The blackout was a redistribution of resources by force. It was criminal and destructive. It was also, paradoxically, a catalyst for one of the most important cultural movements of the 20th century. October 5, 1977, Game 2 of the World Series, Yankee Stadium. As ABC's cameras pan over the stadium, they catch a massive fire at an abandoned school nearby. The phrase, "the Bronx is burning," becomes synonymous with urban collapse. Between 1970 and 1980, 7 census tracts in the Bronx lost more than 97% of their buildings. Over 250,000 people were displaced. At the peak, the South Bronx averaged 40 fires per night. The economics were perverse. Landlords were squeezed by rent control while heating costs skyrocketed. Many found their buildings were worth more dead than alive, so they hired gangs to burn them and collected insurance money. Sometimes tenants received notes warning their building would burn that night. People got used to sleeping with their shoes on, one resident recalled. The city's response was to withdraw rather than reinforce. This approach had a name: planned shrinkage. The logic was that resources were finite, so the city should withdraw services in the most blighted neighborhoods to accelerate their depopulation. Between 1974 and 1976, exactly when the arson wave was cresting, the city closed 12 fire companies in the South Bronx. When President Carter visited Charlotte Street, he stood on blocks of vacant lots and burned out buildings. Part of the street had been removed from city maps because there was nothing left to map, but communities fought back. The People's Development Corporation, founded in 1975, trained residents to rebuild their own neighborhoods. They invested sweat equity, unpaid labor, rebuilding one building at a time. As filmmaker Vivian Vasquez Irizarry documented, "We did not burn the South Bronx, we were the ones who saved it." By 1980, graffiti covered every train car, every single one. Vehicle reliability was 1/10 of what it had been in the 60s. Trains derailed, on average, every 18 days. 1/3 of the fleet sat out of service during rush hours. Photographer Bruce Davidson recalled his fear going down subway stairs. "A sense of fear gripped me." By 1979, 250 or more felonies occurred weekly on the system. And yet life continued underground. People caught sleep, read papers, commuted through graffiti-covered cars. The subway developed its own culture. The Guardian Angels emerged in February of 1979. Curtis Sliwa, a McDonald's night manager, founded them. They wore red berets and trained in martial arts but remained unarmed. They patrolled the dangerous 4 train, developing a signal system where an unattended door meant someone needed backup. Graffiti writers saw the trains differently, as rolling canvases that traveled to all 5 boroughs. A writer named Taki won 83 obsessively tagged trains in the early 70s. On July 21, 1971, the New York Times ran an article bringing graffiti into mainstream awareness. The art form rapidly evolved. By 1973, writers were painting entire cars. Wild-style lettering emerged from the Bronx, interlocking letters and arrows unreadable to civilians but coded with meaning. To the transit authority, graffiti was vandalism. To young artists, it was identity assertion, a way to become visible in a city that rendered working-class youth invisible. The subway was the city in microcosm, dangerous, broken, but also creative, democratic in its chaos, and still moving. Despite everything, it still moved. The nostalgia for 1970s New York is complicated. Some of it is selective memory, romanticizing danger from a safe distance. But there's something real underneath. The affordability wasn't imaginary. A quarter cup of coffee, 35-cent subway rides, $300 lofts. These were real. The ability to survive on part-time work while dedicating yourself to art, that was real too. Cultural historian Sarah Schulman documents how the widespread displacement of working-class Jews, Latinos, and African Americans has severely damaged the city's cultural ecosystem. The very affordability that enabled hip-hop, punk, and downtown art has been erased. What remains authentic in the nostalgia is the quality of human connection. Necessity bred creativity. Hip-hop came from block parties because clubs were expensive. Poverty created community rather than isolation. Neighbors knew each other because they shared struggles. Physical presence was required for connection in an era without cell phones. You couldn't text to change plans. You showed up at the agreed time, and if someone didn't show, you waited or you left. Photographer Martha Cooper captured it simply. People are nostalgic for the small family shops and restaurants that anchored a neighborhood. There were few chains like Starbucks or McDonald's. Patti Smith wrote, "Life at the Chelsea was an open market, everyone with something of himself to sell. The hotel is an energetic, desperate haven for scores of gifted, hustling children from every rung of the ladder. That energy, desperate and gifted at once, defined the era." So here's the answer to our opening question. How does a bankrupt, burning city become the coolest place on earth? It becomes cool by accident as a side effect of failure. When the city stopped regulating, artists could claim illegal lofts. When the economy collapsed, rent dropped low enough that survival became possible on minimal income. When the city stopped maintaining the subway, graffiti writers turned it into a rolling gallery. The grit and the soul weren't separate. They're the same thing, viewed from different angles. You can't separate hip-hop from the poverty that made block parties necessary. You can't separate punk from the economic conditions that made safety pins a fashion statement by accident. But here's what matters most. The people refused to be abandoned. When President Ford told the city to drop dead, when banks closed the credit window, when City Hall prepared to announce default, the people who lived here didn't leave. They organized. The People's Development Corporation trained residents to rebuild. DJ Kool Herc threw a party to raise money for school clothes. The Guardian Angels started patrolling the subway. Teachers invested their pensions to prevent default. They adapted. When music programs were cut from schools, kids turned to turntables. When clubs were too expensive, they threw parties in parks. When apartments were freezing, artists built their own walls and installed their own heat. They created. From rubble and ruin, from poverty and abandonment, they built hip-hop, punk, disco, and modern art. They took the broken pieces of the industrial age, the factory lofts, the vinyl records, the spray paint cans, and made something entirely new. A city can go bankrupt, its government can fail, its infrastructure can crumble. But people with a beat, a spray can, or a guitar, people who refuse to abandon each other, they cannot be bankrupted. They cannot be evicted from the culture they create together. That's the real story of 1970s New York, not the crime statistics or budget numbers. The story is what people built in the gaps where the city stopped functioning. The story is the refusal to accept abandonment. New York in the 1970s proved something essential, that creativity doesn't require perfect conditions. It requires time, space, and people who won't quit. People make culture, and when you give people just enough room to breathe, to create, to connect, they'll make something nobody expected, even in a city that's burning, even when the president says drop dead, even when every bank declares you worthless. The people will create anyway. That's what 1970s New York taught us. And that's a lesson worth remembering, especially now, when cities feel increasingly unaffordable, when the conditions for art and survival seem impossible to reconcile. They will create. Because people always do. As long as there's a beat, a spray can, or a guitar, as long as there are stoops to sit on and stories to tell, as long as people refuse to be abandoned, that's the soul that survives the grit. That's what endures.